Testing. Good.
They opened at 5:30. Yeah. So,
Test, test, test. Test. That's not too loud, I don't think. That's a little, hold it down here maybe.
Yeah, that one I think was. Another one was kind of softer, so then there was one that was super loud, and then the others where people like even had it right up to their face, and it was so hard to kind of hear.
Yeah, I don't know why somebody turned on the volume on that. I portable unit, so I don't know if our guy did it or somebody up there was trying to control it.
Because it was these,
Right,
the
right.
ones that, the CCP ones.
Right, that's what I just adjusted.
Okay. So do you think these are a little bit louder?
Well, I don't know. Test, 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 test. You do have to hold it up here, which is how they should be held. Maybe the lavalier you can put down here, but handhelds should be up closer.
I think we just have to focus more on testing.
Test, 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 test. Well, I can turn it up loud, but if I turn it up too loud, you'll start getting the feedback. So it's good to get it close to the. Test, test, test. Yeah, if they can hold it within 6 inches of their mouth, they'll be good. They just can't hold it down here. Well, if I turn up any louder, you'll start getting some weird noises, so they got to talk close to it. Test, 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 test. So I think they're all set good as long as they hold it about like this. Test, 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 test. That's not very loud. Test, 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 test.
give you the time. It'll be good. I'll give you notes. I know, I don't know how to do it. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't get me started. I have a Mac. I work on Mac. All right, are we ready? Yeah. I think we're going to get started. If you don't mind taking your seats, please. I know, we don't have another welcome. It is. Okay, don't. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started soon, so if you wouldn't mind sitting down, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Ann Breckinridge Barrett, Director of the Center for Creative Photography. If you weren't here last night, welcome. It was an incredible evening. What insane energy. I want to thank Britt for setting the stage last night and examining the medium's evolution from the 1970s forward. She's really set us up for an incredible day today. And also Fern and Charles for sharing your firsthand experiences at Light. It was a great way to start. A few things. If you all don't know, the center has a membership program. And it's just not folks in Tucson or Arizona. We have folks regionally and all over the country. So I encourage you to join, not only to support the work that we do here, but also for those of you in New York, we're once again hosting a trip to the new Perry Photo New York, AKA APAD. And we're planning events around the country as well. So if you want information about that, please go ahead and ask at the front desk or just go online. Now, in the spirit of Harold Jones and the calendars that he produced at Light for those years, we've decided that we're going to start doing the same thing. And here it is. This is the first one. It's in that spirit, and they're on sale at the front desk for $25, so please don't leave without one. Let's see. Today's schedule. Okay, this morning is going to be an intensive investigation of Light and its moment in the 70s and 80s, concluding with a conversation between presenters and the audience. You'll have an hour and a half for lunch, and we will meet back here at 1:30 for 2 panel discussions and a screening of our new film, which I'm so excited about. It's called Light, When Photography Was Undiscovered. This evening, we will hope that you'll join us at the opening reception at Terry Etherton's gallery for Frank Golke, Mark Klett, Mike Mulno, and Michael Berman. Now, since we're going to be sitting most of today, I thought we might engage in a bit of yoga. No, I'm kidding. like you're like, okay. But I will ask you to indulge me right now and stand if you fall into one of these categories. And Eli's gonna. If you worked at Light Gallery, would you please stand? If you showed your work at Light Gallery, would you please stand? And if you visited Light Gallery, would you please stand? Welcome, Light community. Now, I would like to invite Fern Schad to come up and introduce this morning's presenters.
Well, clearly I'm involved not only in photography but in public speaking. This is my new career. I'll be standing on boxes on the corners of Manhattan streets addressing who's ever going to listen to me. I've got to get up closer. Welcome again to this amazing event. I'd like to introduce our speakers, two very early employees of Light Gallery, both of whom have gone on to do amazing and very different things concerning photography. Marvin Heiferman and Sally Stein. Will you please come up?
Great.
Tell me if I'm audible. Yes? Yeah. Okay. I don't have a PowerPoint and I don't have a written out paper. I decided this should be informal, and it may risk being a little too autobiographical, but as Britt reminded us last night, the 70s were the me decade. And actually, well, I always think of myself as a kind of outlier. And coming to Light and getting a job there was for me kind of a fluke. I was a very young 21-year-old, although of course I thought I was worldly and knew everything about the world at the time. I had always been interested in photography. My mother actually had gone to the Museum of Modern Art when she was in college in the 30s and had bought many photo publications, including the Walker Evans book, which I crayoned on as a child, and also the Margaret Burke White Erskine Caldwell book. I'm really sorry I don't have those books now. She actually, at some point, discovered I had crayoned on them and threw them out as damaged beyond repair. I would love to see how I crayoned on them. I actually think I learned to read. I was a slow reader and learned to read from the Erskine Caldwell infamous captions invented to those pictures in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. No, excuse me. You have seen their faces. In 1971 fall, I had finished coursework at college, actually my second college to attend because I was being an outlier, had been thrown out of my first university after a sit-in at the University of Chicago. But I still, at Barnard College back in New York where I grew up, had to write a honors thesis. And at Thanksgiving in '71, I had told my parents, who were ardent Zionists, that I was writing my senior thesis under Edward Said, a Palestinian, about the Civil War 36 to 39 in Palestine under the British mandate. At which point, my father, who had already survived my getting expelled from the University of Chicago, said, "That's the limit. We have paid your fees for the year. You are on your own, not a penny more." Turned to my mother and said, "Did you hear me? Not a penny. You're not slipping her any money. She is on her own." at which point I had always waitressed to get extra money. So I thought, okay, living in the Upper West Side, Washington Heights, which is where I lived, was very cheap if you had roommates. I thought I can survive waitressing and finish out the year and then get a regular job. But after a couple of weeks waitressing at the West End near Columbia, I thought, oh God, do I want to do this for the whole year while I'm writing this thesis? And the end of the fall, I had gone to the first opening at Light because my friend Susan Meiselis, a couple of years older and much hipper, said, let's meet there. And so we met at that opening. So in early January, I stopped at the gallery, and I had already seen the first show, and said to Harold, you don't know of any jobs in photography, because I had always been interested in photography. I remembered going to the Family of Man, which was kind of so crowded when I was 5 years old. It was kind of frightening, but remembered the Dorothea Lange exhibition of 1966, Bill Brandt, et cetera. And he said, yes, actually someone just left who used to work the front desk. Do you want to work the front desk? And I said, yeah, sure. And thus I became an early employee at Light Gallery. I realized quickly, the scene was very proper at 1018 Madison. I had to leave my radical student politics at the door. And I did that. I mean, I think I still looked like the scruffiest person there. Harold was very Tony with his bow tie, and he had this kind of mod British look. So I tried to kind of emulate, sort of figure out how to look a little spiffier while still being a scruffy student, and decided, leaving my politics at the door as much as I could, which was hard for me at the time, decided to try to take in Harold's politics of a faith in contemporary photography. Sometimes my politics leaked out. I drew the line at less crims. And his puerile retake on Philip Roth's relation to his Jewish mother. But Harold listened, not just politely, tolerantly, but thoughtfully. And I remember him saying, I can see that. It didn't change anything that happened in the gallery, but it was extremely thoughtful and responsive. It wasn't just like, you don't know what you're talking about. And even yesterday when Marvin and I interviewed Harold for posterity, he said, yeah, I remember our discussions about those kinds of things like feminism, because of course I thought I knew at this point everything about feminism as well. And in turn, his model of listening and thinking respectfully taught me to listen, or at least to watch. In retrospect, I was too much of a jeune know-it-all to ask all the questions I wish I had now asked. And there were so many questions now I wish I had asked. And Harold sensed my interest in deciphering photographs, and sometimes would actually encourage me. I remember once he said, we're doing Charles Gatewood, but I don't know what to say about this, so that's your job, and you have to write the press release. And for me, it was a real challenge. Of course, I knew some gay guys, but the idea of how does one write about a gay photographer was something I had to work on, but Harold said yes, and I still remember it wasn't yet published or anything, but people at the gallery who were visiting at the time went, who wrote this? And Harold went, Sally wrote this. So it was also very generous in that way. What I remembered here in many ways, I'm repeating points that Fern made last night about the great respect, and I think this imbued in me a kind of respect to learn about this respect for photography, for contemporary photography. I mentioned last night from the audience, let's remember these were all in 8x10 boxes when people brought portfolios in at the time. But actually, I will amend what I said, because while most of the material was in 8x10 boxes, including Harry's work at the time, Aaron's were usually in 11x14 boxes. But then I learned about, how to present with these overmats, and then the Nielsen frames. And then when I would go to the Museum of Modern Art, I would actually go, we do a much nicer, more respectful job of presentation than MoMA, where still much of the work, this is before 73, I think. Much of the work was simply sandwiched between two sheets of glass. No, I'm not sure even if there were overmats to protect the surface of the photograph. And then they would use silver tape to tape the whole sandwich together. I still don't know, well, how did they attach it to the wall? I never decided to take it off and see. We'll have to find that out from someone from MoMA. And as Fern mentioned last night, the respect for both the photograph and the photographer and a tradition and an emerging canon that Light helped develop of contemporary photography. But also, and I hope Fern doesn't, I think this mainly elaborates on what Fern mentioned last night, how costly such an operation was. I actually came from a kind of downwardly mobile family. I mean, they were still middle class, but there was not a lot of feathers in the nest to cushion all this, and to realize how much it costs to start a startup, especially when very few people were buying. And one of my extra jobs, along with sometimes helping with doing all the things that Girl Fridays and Gallery Girls did at the time, one of the jobs was, I soon discovered, Harold around 4:45 would say, "I'm going for a walk." And I thought, oh, okay, at the end of the day, but the day is almost ending. We would close at 6. But then I realized at some point he was going for a walk because Tennyson would be coming by at around 5:15 after he had closed up his office in Midtown. And he would stop on the way home to his home on the Upper East Side, and he would come in very nicely, but soon, and he would look around, and then he'd go, okay, how did we do today? And 90% of the time, one had to figure out a way of saying, we did nothing today. But Harold decided I could manage this better, and it would be, well, there were 2 people looking at a strand, and the strands were actually more pricey. Actually, the strands in the summers were some astronomical $1,000, but everything else was, I think the Emmett Gowan started at 75 in the very earliest year. Harry's were 125, et cetera. And even those weren't moving all that much. And I would be the one who would have to say, there were people here, maybe a few people, and they were interested, but nothing materialized. And sort of Tuesday to Saturday, no, Saturday Harold stayed until, but Tuesday to Friday, I would have to develop one kind of version of this. But it actually, I was always an anxious person. I still am today. It made me anxious thinking about what's going on there, just bleeding money. As Fern noted about the early years when she steadfastly, I think, kept the books. And somebody yesterday, I think it was Britt at LAX, said, did you ever think about doing a gallery? And I thought, yeah, I thought about it, but my experience at Light told me, unless you have oodles of support, financial support, along with everything else, this is a crazy operation. And it was a crazy operation. I had left after 2 years when it still was just starting. It only became truly more successful and always a little dicey after that as well. So that impressed me too. And the last thing I want to say, because I don't want to run over, is I had already spent, as a kid, a fair amount of time at the Met, but Harold was nice about allowing 45 minutes to an hour, and you were very close to other galleries and also to the Met. So it was a time to check out all of this on the Upper East Side when I lived in Washington Heights. I actually bicycled on good days to work, but I would take the number 4 bus otherwise. And also in the building. And actually I'd asked some of the CCP people, can we get pictures of the elevation of the building and the inside, which had the floors for the elevator, et cetera, which was a slow elevator. But my other recollection is not only being exposed, thanks to Harold, to photography in an intensive way at this time, but also spending a lot of lunch hours downstairs, you're telling me, at Wittenborn. I always thought my memory, but my memories are, like photography, always unreliable. Skewed, and I thought, oh, it was upstairs. And there was this extraordinary art bookstore in this same building. and this was George Wittenborn's shop, which he had started, well, it started in Midtown. I did a little online research. You can all look this up as well. In Midtown, but after his partner died, he moved to 1018, long before, I believe, Light. And it was really an opening to European art and European photography, as well as American art and photography, with really a focus reflecting his own immigrant German background on Europe. But he was also a very important publisher of contemporary art and artists' writings. His own archive is now at MoMA. And he showed in the 60s already the Beckers for the first time in New York, also Hans Hake, et cetera. Before Light carried Avalanche, Avalanche was always up there. So I have this memory of lunch hours. I would take out of my little Dow Chemical sandwich bag my tuna fish sandwich, sit on the stairs eating it, then go downstairs, I guess, to Wittenborn's. And George Wittenborn, because there were only 2 or 3 people working there, would go, as soon as I walked in, "What am I smelling?" And I would go, "Tuna fish?" And he would point me toward his sink and go, "Wash your hands before you touch any of my books." And he would say, "Check out this book." And do you know, I published Maholi in 1946. And I was awed by George Wittenborn and also very impressed with him. But he was also a little scary. I mean, he recognized me as a know-nothing 21-year-old and 22-year-old. And but he would point me out. He showed me the Becker book that he had published. It was the English translation of the German catalog. And in some ways, I regret there wasn't more interaction, and I'll get back to this, between Wittenborn and Light at the time, because he had his own great European sensibility. But there is a fun, as I tried to remember the building and then Wittenborn as well as Light, I remembered I used to look, he was quite tall, and I would look up at him and go, "That's so weird, he has hair growing out of his ears and nose." And I thought, he's as old as Methuselah. When I decided to go online and look up George Wittenborn, I went, shoot, wait, he was only 68. I'm now 70. I'm as old as he was when I encountered him in New York City. And thus I want to say something about how this is all based on memory and it is unreliable. But I do wish now, in some ways, there had been, thinking about Wittenborn and why there wasn't any more interaction with Wittenborn. I know Harold also would go upstairs or downstairs. Why do I keep thinking of Wittenborn above us, but below us, and would check things out, and then started carrying Avalanche. But it makes me understand, and we can talk about this later, how much this new Light Gallery was very much American-oriented. There were a couple of people with European connections, Cortege and Strand, a kind of expat American, only recently returned in the 70s. But it was a very American orientation, and that was Harold's orientation at the time. I want to say that coming to CCP later, I'm glad to see that it began to expand much more toward thinking about Tucson on the border and thinking about Mexico as well, and more interest in Hispanic culture and Hispanic photography, Latino photography. But this was very much Harold's show. For worse and for better, mainly for better, Tennyson greatly respected it. It's impressive how much the person who was funding this stepped aside and let Harold run the show. And we all learned a lot from it, especially myself, who then went on from history to think while I went to RISD, I adored Harry Callahan's work and wanted to study with him. When I was at RISD, I thought, I'm never going to be a photographer like Harry Callahan. And I took my first formal photo history class and thought, this is terrible. I could do better than this if only I learned more. and went on in that direction. And yet, it all started for me with light. That's it. Thank you.
It was something new for me to find out how I got my job at Light yesterday, because I also kind of came to the gallery in some serendipitous form. I had dropped out of film school at Columbia, an MFA program, decided I wanted to be a painter, thought that I needed to get a job also, so I was kind of frequenting art galleries, which were then in the Madison Avenue neighborhood uptown, and apparently went into Light Gallery often enough that Sally realized that there was this guy who was coming in all the time and looking at pictures on the wall and spending a lot of time there, which it's kind of funny. So at some point I came in too and asked for a job, and Harold said, yeah, I've seen you around here, so sure, why don't you start working here? So I had no background in photography at all, and not so much in art, as I was kind of self-taught and read and had taken some courses here and there, and started working at the gallery, working at the front desk, right? Sally was working there at the time. While we were there, Peter McGill was our intern, right? At some period, it was kind of an incredible cast of characters, but not knowing about photography, I needed to learn about it while I was working there. And Harold was the perfect person to learn from, because Harold's kind of spirit about photography was just look, right? Just look at stuff, think about stuff, let's talk about stuff. And so, as a number of people have suggested, there was not a tremendous amount of business there at the time. It was not like there were a lot of people walking in the door and buying pictures. We had a lot of time on our hands. So there were flat files, and you would open up the flat files and you could look at every photograph that Harry Callahan made, or you could look at every photograph that Frederick Sommer made. And the kind of dialogue around photography was subtle. It wasn't didactic in any kind of way at all, but the enthusiasm for looking at pictures, right, and for being open-minded in terms of what you might come across in those draws, and the conversations about the pictures were incredible. And then people would come in, and it was, every once in a while it might be a buyer, but it would just as often be students and photographers, and people would just be talking and looking. It was a moment when there had been galleries in New York. There were photography galleries before Light. It's not the first one. In the 1950s, Helen G. was showing photographs. Roy DeCarava had a gallery. Marge Nykrug had a gallery in the late 1960s. Lee Whitkin had a gallery. But as Fern suggested last night, those places were in people's brownstones. They were kind of claustrophobic places. You would go to Whitkin Gallery and it would be like going to a record store, and you'd flip through pictures and files. And what Harold did that was extraordinary was basically say, we're going to treat photographers like artists, right? We're going to represent photographers. Our goal is not just to sell pictures, but our goal is to get pictures into museum collections, and we're going to do it the right way. So as was discussed, there's a certain kind of respect paid to these objects, right, which was another thing, teaching people that photographs were objects that were made thoughtfully and with care was extraordinary, because people used to say, when, if you would try to sell somebody a Harry Callahan, they'd say, well, how do I know the guy's not going to go nuts and go in his darkroom and print up 200 of them? And you'd have to say, well, you can't. It doesn't work like that. But people still weren't used to seeing photography. Sitting at the front desk, right, at 1018 Madison Avenue, I was right by the elevator door, and one of my favorite Light Gallery memories is sitting there, and as Sally described, things were, and Fern described, things were carefully framed. Everything at Light Gallery was framed in Nielsen frames. There were these thin little aluminum frames. And so, and Harold had a very kind of elegant installation style, which was something that I certainly learned a lot from in terms of how photographs should be presented. And I remember sitting at the front desk and the elevator door opened, right? And I saw a woman's head come in, and she looked down the wall, right? And it was a long wall. And she saw what must have been 15 or 20 identically sized, identically matted, identically framed things on the wall. And she said, oh, photographs. And she left. And that's what Light Gallery was like, to a certain extent. Yesterday, when we were interviewing Harold, he was talking about trying to raise awareness for what was going on at the gallery, and he tried to get the New York Times to list the gallery in its art listings, right? And the woman who he spoke with said, photography is not an art, so why would we list you, right? And part of what was incredible about the early years at the gallery, and we were there early on, I'm very conscious of the fact that we were at Light Gallery maybe for the first fifth of its history, right? Or the first quarter of its history, maybe, was the educational aspect that the gallery served. The gallery was a focal point for people to come to. And people, as Fern was talking about last night, openings were a big deal, right? And people would come, people would hang out, people would talk. And there were not that many places to have those kind of conversations. At that point, the introduction of contemporary photography was not happening in a lot of places. MoMA was where people kind of looked to, right, for this to happen. And in fact, while people like Peter Bunnell and Dennis Longwell and some of the curators at MoMA used to come around, John Sarkowski almost never came around, because John Sarkowski, from my perspective, sitting there, didn't particularly like the idea that there was another game in town, right? And there was another place for photographers to go to, and there was another conversation that was happening, right? And that's where light starts to be an interesting thing, because you start to see how that conversation happens there and how museums started coming to us. There's a handful of museums were collecting stuff. I remember Davis Pratt from the Fogg at Harvard would come in. I remember Keith Davis would be around from Hallmark. I remember the original small group of collectors who would come in. But it was a very gradual kind of thing.
I just want to add that Weston, who was
Yeah.
very close by,
Weston Neff at the Met, right.
Weston at the Met, and then later at the Getty, would come by often in his lunch hour.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if he bought, but he had actually already collected Stephen Shore.
Yeah.
I just wanted to
Yeah, yeah. So it was a gradual thing. As Sally said, the gallery was in a neighborhood with lots of other galleries. Castelli Gallery was around the corner. Sotheby's was down the block, right? Marion Goodman, who was then running a gallery called Multiples, was also around the corner. So there was an interesting community of people, and people started coming into the gallery. And I think because of the gallery's program, the gallery's location, there started to be a broader conversation going on about photography at that time that was was a very interesting thing to have. And the other thing about the gallery that, in retrospect, I guess it was kind of normal operating procedure at the time, and Fern spoke about this last night, was the turnover of exhibitions, right? Galleries were doing an exhibition it was 3 weeks. They ran 3 weeks and 4 weekends, which was, and Light Gallery, Harold had the gallery set up so there were always 2, if not 3 shows at a time. So in the course of a year, right, you would do 36 shows, right? It was a tremendous amount of imagery to come out, a tremendous amount of work to look at, a tremendous amount of work to do, but the conversation kind of grew out of that. And slowly people started paying attention to photography. There was a publication called Print Collector's Newsletter that was also in an office around the corner, run by a woman named Jackie Brody, that was monitoring the print market. And the photography market at that point, or whatever market it was kind of unregulated. Nobody was editioning prints. Everything was kind of one-off. Print Collector's Newsletter started writing about photography, started doing these roundtables where we talked about stuff. So slowly people started coming around. Slowly things started selling, right? But very slowly. And there was a frustration with it if you worked there, because the passion around photography was intense at that place. And so you would sit around, and if nobody came in, you'd say, what's going on with this? So Harry Callahan pictures were $75. One day we'd get pissed off and we'd raise the price to $125, right? Which was the kind of stuff that happened there. And as I said, it was an extraordinary place. Personally, for me, it was a real learning curve. As I suggested, I learned about photography from looking at pictures and conversations with photographers, right, and with curators. And then it got to a point where I had been there about 2 years, 2.5 years, and Harold was going to come here, right? And kind of said to me, do you want to run the gallery? And I said, no, I want to be an artist. Fire me, right? I want to collect unemployment. And Harold said, sure. And in fact, I just found the letter in my files the other day where Harold said, you're terminated, like, bye-bye. So, which was great. And then I got to spend 18 months painting, right? And my unemployment ran out, and I needed a job. And at that point, I was talking to a friend of mine who worked at Castelli Gallery, and he said, why don't you take my job, right? And Castelli at that point was representing Louis Baltz, Robert Adams, John Gossage, Ralph Gibson, and a handful of people, and they didn't know what they were doing with photography, so they hired me. Leo Castelli and his wife, Swanee Castelli, hired me, and I went there. And that was an interesting thing, because I got there, and I remember Louis going to a lecture that Louis Baltz was giving at Cooper Union. I was just hired at the gallery. We were just about to show the new industrial parks, right? And I go listen to Louis give this talk, right? And all he's talking about is the social, economic surroundings of these pictures and not the pictures themselves. And I'm thinking, this is another world, right? This is another way to deal with photography. And it turns out, in fact, that Louis was really nervous that I was from Light Gallery, right? He thought that Light Gallery represented one sensibility. He was another sensibility altogether. And what was interesting for me was to move to another gallery. I stayed there for 6 years and built up a pretty big program, pretty robust program in terms of photography, but it was very different than the Light Gallery sensibility. And part of, in talking about the legacies of Light Gallery, I think what's interesting is what Light Gallery did do and didn't do, and the kind of thinking that encouraged people to go on and explore photography in very, very different ways. So when I was at Castelli, I kind of came out of this modernist Light Gallery thinking, but I'm working with people like Robert Rauschenberg and Ed Ruscha and Andy Warhol, right? And at the same time, I had a boyfriend who was in the Whitney Independent Study Program, so through him, I'm hanging out with Cindy Sherman, Richard Prince, Sherry Levine, Barbara Kruger, and at the same time, I'm doing shows with Eve Arnold, right, and Mary Ellen Mark, and looking at portfolios that come in the door, which we were talking about yesterday. And one of the people who walks in the door is Nan Golden, who I went on to work with for 10 years, producing The Ballad of Sexual Dependency and stuff. So my interest in photography diverged from Light Gallery's interest. And Light seemed to me to be a very programmatic way of looking at photography, and it seemed to me that the art photography world seemed like it was a very programmatic way of looking at photography. And because I had that history and was working with artists who were using photography in very different ways, and conceptual artists were using photography in different ways, I went on to do something very, very different than Light Gallery. But in thinking of legacies of Light, right, a lot of what I did came out of what I learned there, right? And what I learned there was a tremendous respect for the medium. And what I learned from Harold was really learning to see pictures, to look at pictures, to think about what went into the making of a picture, what kind of possibilities there were in thinking about pictures, and thinking about how pictures communicated to audiences. And then I eventually got out of the gallery business altogether because I was not interested in working in or running a store, which was a whole other aspect of the gallery business. It's a business, right? And went on to do very different kinds of projects to explore how photography operates in visual culture. But this legacy idea keeps coming back into my mind because the place was special in that sense, that it was a center for people to come, to learn, to talk, to look, and to do as much with that medium as they could. So here we are, years later.
So we're going to have questions and answers that will include Sally and Marvin after we hear from our other morning speakers. So maybe we'll conclude there, and I'll introduce Michal, and we'll bring you back when we do Q&A. Okay. I promise, you'll all have a chance to talk with our great panelists.
Well, you might notice it's really hot in here. Yeah. So I was told, basically what happened was last night we had incredible capacity, and so the system recalibrated to expect overcapacity, so it started blowing cold air into the auditorium. So there's a person out there right now recalibrating everything, and then they're going to blast some hot air. So just please bear with us, but it's not something that we're ignoring, because I'm freezing too. Okay, so there you go.
All right. All right. Next, we're going to hear from Michal Raz-Russo. Michal is the David and Sarajean Ruttenberg Associate Curator of Photography at the Art Institute of Chicago. Among her exhibitions at the Art Institute are Never a Lovely So Real, Photography and Film in Chicago, 1950 to 1980, from 2018. Invisible Man, Gordon Parks and Ralph Ellison in Harlem, from 2016. Sharp, Clear Pictures, Edward Steichen's World War I and Condé Nast Years of 2014, and Dayanita Singh of 2014, and The Three Graces of 2011. She is also curator of the Art Institute's biennial Ruttenberg Contemporary Photography Series, which has presented solo exhibitions of new work by artists such as Lee Ladair and Deanna Lawson. Please join me in welcoming Michal Raz-Russo.
Thank you, Becky, for that introduction. Thank you, Anne, as well, for hosting, and the staff here at the CCP. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honor. I'll start with first full disclosure. I wasn't born when Light Gallery opened, which I feel is necessary to state. My relationship to Light Gallery was through my graduate studies. In 2009, I conducted research right here at the Light Gallery Archives with the wonderful assistance of Leslie Squires, who was instrumental in the research, and I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing Harold Jones. And the resulting paper was very much grounded in what I found in the archive and has truly influenced the work that I've done since. So, as I said, it's really just a pleasure and an honor to be here today. And I acknowledge that I'm going to bring a slightly different perspective here. I'm going to bring the perspective of a curator and an art historian. And it's kind of a fascinating position to be in the context of all the great conversations that are happening. And so I'll begin with a little bit of a background. What led me to Light was my study of the history of the factors that led to the formation of the market for photography in the 1970s. And as Marvin just recounted, it was a time when interest in photography appeared to be split into two camps. The first was marked by a desire to preserve and elevate photography as an autonomous art form, and that's reflected in the formation of its market. And second, the embrace of photography's vernacular forms and expression, where it was seen as a medium or material capable of challenging the traditional display and distribution systems of the art world. And the narratives I encountered typically positioned commercial galleries as choosing one camp or the other. And the case in point for this is the great story that we just heard about Harold Jones trying to list gallery in the New York Times art section and them refusing him, saying that it wasn't appropriate. And what this anecdote tells us is that Light didn't fit this oversimplified trajectory of the history of photography, but it was at its center. And what I find exciting about being here today, celebrating this groundbreaking space, is that we get to hear firsthand experiences of these events, and on the other hand, see how the history of the gallery has been absorbed and contextualized over time within evolving art historical narratives. And the question this brings up for me is, what does it mean to learn the history of a gallery through an archive? What histories do archives such as this, meaning an archive of essentially commercial space, tell us, and what stories emerge? What is certain, and as we've already heard, is that Light mediated many of the complex and contradicting discourses that emerged during those years and brought to the surface the connective tissue between them. They did groundbreaking work in the establishment and promotion of the market for photography, even as they embraced the work of artists who were using and questioning its many forms. Ultimately, they had a hand in opening the door for a broader understanding of the field within an institutional context, and over the years, this has led to a broader and more diverse understanding and embrace of the field. And the first slide I have up is an early advertisement that I found in the archive, which shows a hand holding a pendulum. And my interpretation of this was that it was a kind of metaphor for the gallery, meaning that it responded to external elements, but it moved according to its own force. And indeed, Light, as we've already heard and will continue to hear, was responsible for many firsts. It was experimental and fearless, not only with what they exhibited, but importantly with how they exhibited work. And this is what I want to focus on today. I'm going to hone in on several early exhibitions and gallery ephemera that act as case studies for Light's approach to the display and communication, and underscore the reading of these ideas through the archive and through the lens of history. I'll begin with what I believe is one of Light's most groundbreaking presentations, and certainly one of the most groundbreaking presentations in the history of color photography. The installation of Stephen Shore's American Surfaces, which was on view at Light from September through October 1972. American Surfaces was the documentations of Shore's year-long road trips across the United States, a project that fell somewhere between a frank visual diary and social document. Although he was influenced by Robert Frank and Walker Evans, Shore's portrait of America was not meant to be sentimental or politicized. Rather, his view was honest and personal, infused with cynicism, humor, and crassness. There are photographs depicting slept-in beds and unfinished meals in roadside motels, deadpan photographs of abandoned commercial buildings and deserted intersections, and intimate yet harsh portraits of individuals both familiar and strange. As Shore recently noted, he wanted to, quote, take pictures that were not burdened by visual conventions, pictures that felt like seeing, end quote. To record his journey, Shore used a Rolly 35mm camera with a mounted flash, often used as an everyday point-and-shoot camera, and, like an amateur hobbyist, had the film subsequently developed at a Kodak lab. The resulting images were standard 3 by 5.5-inch glossy Kodak color prints with white borders, the kind of drugstore prints associated with family or vacation snapshots. And you see an example here of the scale and feel of the prints, and both this image and the image inside the image were part of American Surfaces. At Light, Shore arranged the prints himself in the back room, also known as the Small Gallery, and in an early prospectus, Light's Small Gallery at their 1018 Madison Avenue location was designated to present the work of, quote, promising new photographers. The room contained a row of the gallery's infamous low metal flat file drawers, and photographs were typically hung along 3 of its walls, and you can see here a photo of the room. In the Small Gallery, Shore chose 174 prints and adhered them directly to the wall in a grid 3 rows high that covered the 3 walls of the room. No frames, no glass, just tape. The presentation echoed the idea of photographs that felt like seeing and reinforced the project as a visual diary, but it also spoke to the nature of the objects themselves in Shore's process. There are no installation photos that survive from that installation, and much of what we know about it is reconstructed from ephemera such as exhibition reviews, which I'll return to in a bit. And this original installation of the work, even though the work has been shown widely, this original format installation was not recreated until MoMA's Stephen Shore retrospective that took place in 2017. And you see here my iPhone shot of that installation, which I was very excited to see. And here's another view of it with superimposed with the view of Light's back gallery to give you a sense. And this was not the only time that a grid was used in exhibitions at Light, and you see that in the bottom image. But perhaps best known among these kinds of gridded presentations was Gary Winogrand's 1975 exhibition at Light, which featured a cross-section of his work, most notably images from what would later become his Women Are Beautiful portfolio and book. Like Shore's exhibition, it featured over 100 of Winogrand's 11 by 14-inch gelatin silver prints, and I believe the idea for the installation came from Victor Schrager, although, you know, history's fuzzy about that. But the sampling of photographs was installed in a grid 4 rows high that covered the perimeter and interior movable walls of the gallery's main space. Neither framed nor mounted, the prints were hung 2 inches apart and protected by a sheet of glass mounted to the wall with L-hooks. Harold Jones later noted that he felt like this was a way to show how Winogrand thought and worked. And what you see on the screen is a partial recreation of this installation that I did at the Art Institute of Chicago in 2013 for a show that was titled When Collecting Was New, which dealt with Light Gallery and Whitkin Gallery, and it was done through the lens of a private collection. So I couldn't wait to do this again, to Shore's photographs, after reading about it at Light. Gridded installation, in a grid installation, is a way of simultaneously emphasizing and neutralizing differences and similarities, or even divesting the individual photograph of its aura, underscoring that it is part of a larger context or body of work. And it echoes Winogrand's approach to photography, shooting rapidly and spontaneously. And in this configuration, the compositions have to be studied and interpreted differently than, say, an André Cortège composition, for example. And what is interesting is that Winogrand's work has rarely been shown this way. However, several exhibitions have similarly highlighted his contact sheets instead, reproducing them in a large scale and thus echoing this installation. While Winogrand's installation was critically embraced, Shores, just 3 years prior, received a less than lukewarm reaction. And what I'm going to read to you is I'm going to read to you a passage from an October 5th, 1972 review in the Village Voice of the exhibition written by A.D. Coleman, which is one of the only accounts we have from the time about the exhibition. And this was also one of the only records of it that I found in the archive. So it goes, quote, "American surfaces is thin, benumbing, and banal. No surprises, as Ed Ruscha would say. Historians of the future will, of course, turn to this sort of material for the purposes of visual anthropology. Collectors of the future will also get into Kodak color imagery, if only because there's nothing in a disposable culture which will not eventually be collectible, as they say in the trade. But I'm sure they won't pay $500 for a set like this, in an unlimited edition, no less. It's not even dull. It's not only dull, it isn't even archival." So just a couple of notes, it did sell. A set was bought actually by Weston Neff, curator of photography at the Metropolitan Museum, and it was gifted to the Met in 1974, and they still have that copy. But I will say that Coleman did have kind of a point about it not being archival. Every installation I've seen of this always contains exhibition copies, but that's for another discussion. But in spite of the critical reception, I like to think that Stephen Shore and Harold Jones smiled a little when they saw the review. And the reason for this is the exhibition's printed announcement. It featured an anonymous image alongside the exhibition details. This black and white reproduction, found by Shore in a newspaper, featured two men standing side by side, each holding a 35mm negative sheet with pride. It is unknown whether they are amateur or professional photographers or where the final images will circulate, and in this way, the gallery subtly introduced its audience to the important questions raised by the exhibition. Among them, what kinds of photographs should be and can be assigned value, and what photographic practices are to be considered fine art. And indeed, Light's printed announcements and invitations, especially in those early years, embraced this debate through an often wry use of image and text. And these documents are a powerful lens through which to understand the gallery's approach. Take, for example, Light's very first exhibition announcement, dating from fall 1971, which could in many ways serve as a defining statement. It was an announcement for the exhibition 13 Photographers, which featured 4 to 6 works from each of its contracted photographers. The exhibition featured prints by established photographers such as Harry Callahan, Aaron Siskin, and Frederick Sommer, as well as newer artists making photo-based multimedia works or working with alternative processes such as Douglas Prince and Thomas Barrow. And I know that there's nothing that gives as much pleasure to photo folks, or maybe even regret, as seeing a price list from 1970, so that's why I put it up, and you could see which prints sold at the time. The inside of the folded invitation featured on the right the exhibition's title, dates, and list of artists, and on the left, one half of a stereo card depicting a turn-of-the-century reception room with the heading, Light, a gallery for contemporary photography. The image was neither taken by one of the gallery artists, nor was it meant to represent the interior of the gallery physically or metaphorically. Rather, it was a found stereo card from the collection of Harold Jones, intended to provoke curiosity and challenge expectations of what a photography gallery should be. There we go. When it opened, Light's only commercially viable predecessor in New York was the influential Witkin Gallery, which opened in 1969. However, Lee Witkin designed his gallery as an intimate space that featured salon-style installations and the now infamous bins in which one could flip through matted photographs, which also happened to be 20th century masterpieces. But in many ways, the gallery was conceived as a reaction to the modernist and post-war white cube gallery. And so it's interesting, again, to see how these galleries represent themselves. This is a postcard that Witkin Gallery used to send correspondence on. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, as we just heard from Marvin, were galleries like Castelli in New York, which exhibited photographs by artists such as Louis Baltz or Bruce Nauman, beginning in the mid and late 1960s. And you can see the photographs. This is an installation of Louis Baltz's work. Photographs are hung directly on the wall. They're treated like objects or even a sculpture. And a lot of these artists were working with photography but didn't necessarily identify themselves as photographers. And museums, as also we just discussed, were somewhere in between, most notably MoMA, who was one of the first museums to establish a separate department for photography. And what you see on the screen is a landmark 1967 exhibition, which Britt spoke about yesterday briefly, New Documents, which featured the work of then up-and-coming photographers, Diane Arbus, Lee Friedlander, and Gary Winogrand. And in curator John Cherkowski's words, these photographers had, quote, redirected the technique and aesthetic documentary photography to more personal ends. Their aim had not been to reform life, but to know it. And what you see in cases like this is that photography is spoken about in terms of a style of seeing or, quote, a window into the world, putting weight on aesthetic choices that downplayed photography's vernacular's practices and form in an effort to keep it elevated. But once again, the photographs are hung directly on the wall. They're not matted, they're not framed. And so light existed at the intersection of these ideas and means of presentation in terms of who they exhibited, but importantly, how. It was a white cube gallery. It existed right physically at the center of the art world of New York. It experienced a really wide, incredibly wide range of artists who were thinking about the whole of photography, and they thought about how those ideas might be communicated through installation. And you see here, this is a not very good reproduction of that very first exhibition at Light Gallery. You see the famous Kulik frames on the wall, and the photographs are really treated quite differently than they had been in some of the other installation images that we have seen. And I want to underscore how interesting it is to look at installation shots and also look at how Light communicated their program in terms of marketing. As I mentioned earlier, through an archival reading, it seems like the gallery's printed invitations gave a wink and a nod to the varied practices that were beginning to challenge photography's isolated position within institutions and within the market. And in the early years, this was kind of a standard format for the invitations, and it very often featured found images or text. And this is the first example. It's a Robert Heineken invitation from 1973, which included an unpublished article by Dr. Carl Chiarenza about Heineken's work, which could almost read like a manifesto for the program. One passage reads, quotes, "Photography here may not be the technique. What photography does is what the work is about." Or this announcement for Thomas Barrow's exhibition from 1974, which reproduced technical instructions for correct image exposure. And the irony being that Barrow was known for his chemical manipulations in prints and negatives that often mediated on what prints are defined as incorrect. And finally, just to go back to Gary Winogrand, this invitation, which has two quotations, one from Robert Frost at the top, which reads, "The fact is the sweetest dream labor knows," and at the bottom a quotation by Gary Winogrand that reads, "There's nothing as mysterious as a fact clearly described." And the last example, just to make sure everybody's paying attention, is perhaps Light's most infamous announcement to Robert Mapplethorpe's first solo exhibition, which was on view in 1973. The exhibition featured a selection of Mapplethorpe's early black and white hand-colored Polaroids, which were initially inspired by found images. And according to Harold Jones, Mapplethorpe was granted an exhibition after walking off the street with a box of Polaroids. In these early images, Mapplethorpe begins to experiment with representations of his own body and those of others, as well as erotic imagery. However, and perhaps these also mark the moment where Mapplethorpe fully embraces photography as a chosen practice, as until that point he had only worked with found images and collage. And the choice of Polaroid is interesting because Polaroids were associated with a kind of test shot before the final shoot. And so what happens is Shore, like Mapplethorpe, like Shore, turns towards photography, embracing vernacular qualities and playing with all of its medium, even if they each upheld it as a kind of fine art form. And this parallels Light's trailblazing approach as well. It embraced the whole of photographic practices while facing the market as well. And the last example that I want to use, which is kind of underscores how important the archive was for my analysis, is the exhibition In the Tradition of Photography 1915 to 1986. So very late exhibition. And it sought to kind of knit together the varied photographic practices and in the process made a very provocative, I feel, statement about Light about a year before it closed. It was curated by artist Collier Shore, who then worked at Light part-time as a registrar while completing her studies at the School of Visual Arts. and in the tradition of took place at the gallery's second location at 724 Fifth Avenue, and assembled the work of over 30 artists in an attempt to loosely construct a critical historical narrative that began with Walker Evans and ended with Sherry Levine. And once again, the exhibition's announcement card is very telling. It divided the artists into two groups. On the left, a list of photographers represented by light, ranging from Paul Strand to Stephen Shore. And on the right, a list of artists who did not necessarily identify as photographers, including, among others, Sarah Charlesworth, Barbara Kruger, and Laurie Simmons. The layout of the card thus isolated the two groups, prepared them for comparative analysis, and set up an evolutionary dialogue between them. Accordingly, the installation also separated the work of these two groups. The traditional photographers hung in the gallery's larger space, while the rest hung in a smaller viewing gallery. The arrangement echoed the dichotomy suggested by the exhibition's card. The artists in the smaller gallery were simultaneously encircled by the history of art photography and also positioned to face, by then, photography's market-approved masters. At the gallery's entrance, a 1935 Walker Evans vintage print hung alongside a 1981 rephotograph of a Walker Evans by Sherry Levine from the series titled After, as in After Walker Evans. And this is my best guess of what the prints were based on the checklist. Collier also noted that she tried to get a copy of the same image by both artists, but she didn't succeed. And according to Collier, the pairings reinforce her intent to, quote, flush out shared desires. In other words, when a real Walker Evans is placed next to a Sherry Levine copy in a commercial photography gallery, what is emphasized is their conceptual underpinnings in relationship to the space in which they're shown, meaning the relationship to the market. So in other words, which one has more value? During a period when photography's historians, curators, critics, and artists were drawing boundaries and defining photography's varied practice, this is yet another example of light functioning as a space that questioned and critiqued the market and conceptual shifts happening in photography. And I'm going to conclude with this postcard, which was actually the very first object I encountered when I visited the Light Gallery Archive right here at the CCP, and in many ways kind of guided my approach. It was actually placed as the opener to an album that held the gallery's earliest invitation. It depicts a well-worn rock resting on an expansive desert plain, and the postcard's exceptional feature is a set of track marks trailing the rock, acting as testimony to its caption, quote, a rock that travels across the desert under no apparent means. This found postcard was ordered in large quantity by Harold Jones and used for various gallery correspondence. The photographer is unknown, but the image can be read as a metaphor for the methodology and ideas forged by light. That is, while clearly formed and shaped by its surroundings, the gallery operated in isolation and gained momentum independently, breaking and forming conventions along the way. Thank you.
Great. So next we're going to hear from Andy Greenberg, and after that we'll take a short bathroom, coffee, refill break. And probably, since we're live streaming and people maybe don't know who I am, I'm Becky Senf. I work as the Chief Curator here at the Center for Creative Photography, and I'm going to moderate the discussion with our morning speakers. So Andy Greenberg is a writer, curator, teacher, and arts manager who has been involved with photography and art since the 1970s. As a critic for the New York Times from 1981 to 1991, he covered the rapid ascent of photography within the art world. He later served as director of the Friends of Photography in San Francisco and dean of the undergraduate studies at the Corcoran College of Art and Design, which became part of George Washington University, Washington, D.C. in 2015. His books include Crisis of the Real from Aperture in 1999, Alexei Brodovich from Abrams in 1989 as well, Mike and Doug Starn from Abrams in 1990. His forthcoming book, How Photography Became Contemporary Art, about the rise of photography within contemporary art in the 1970s and 1980s, is being published by Yale University Press in fall of 2020. Greenberg holds a BA from Cornell University and an MFA from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Please join me in welcoming Andy Greenberg.
Thank you, Becky. Good morning, everyone. Well, it's a tough act to follow. Okay, boomers, let's talk about the 70s. Partly that's going to be a matter of reminiscence and nostalgia, as we talked about last night, but I think it's also substantive in an art historical sense, because the 70s were not only the decade in which the medium of photography fulfilled its long ambition to become fully recognized as an art form, but it also became central to the practices and discourses of art itself. And in fact, I would argue, most importantly, photography became the subject of contemporary art starting in the 70s. So that's what this talk is going to be about. I'm going to talk, as Michal suggested, about these two realms of photography. We might call it the photography world, or we might call it fine art photography, and the other world, which is the world of art, contemporary art world, or what we often say is artists using photographs. So I'm going to talk about two realms, and I'm also going to talk about it in two ways. One is as much art historical as I can manage, and the other is autobiographical. I'm not sure which was the me decade, but for today's purposes, it's going to be what I'm talking about. So like my book, it's which is going to be a kind of hybrid of memoir and art history. I hope that this talk manages to put them together in some coherent way. How do I change the slides? Oh. Okay. Aha. Speaking of which, so this is a picture of me in my early days in New York. Obviously, financially doing extremely well, judged by the condition of the soles in my shoes. In any case, it's an historical fact that Light Gallery and I arrived in New York the same year, 1971. Light Gallery arrived in November, or at least that's when its first show was. And just to clarify a question that came up last night, this catalog tells you who the people were in the first show, which was called 13 Photographers. They were Tom Barrow, Michael Bishop, Wynn Bullock, Harry Callahan, Robert Fichter, Emmett Gowan, Roger Merton, we didn't say Roger Merton, B. Nettles, Doug Prince, Aaron Siskin, Keith Smith, Frederick Summer, and Todd Walker. Now we know. This was compiled by Susan Harder. In any case, Light opened in November. I arrived in August. A very hot month, as I remember, and coincidentally also happened to be the month that Diane Arbus committed suicide. If I didn't know that at the time, but if I knew then what I know now, I would have probably run down to West Beth and tried to see if I could lease her apartment. Well, as Dickens said, it was the worst of times and the best of times. New York was this dirty, decrepit, somewhat disgusting, dangerous place to be at the time. It's not recognized. New York today is not recognizable to me from my experience in the 70s. But it was also this incredible time of artistic ferment, and that applied across a lot of areas that I was interested in. I didn't arrive in New York as a critic or even thinking about being a critic, although I was interested in photography. When I went to Cornell in the late 60s, I had tried to take a photography course, and this is echoes what Harold experienced with the New York Times listings. I went to the art department and said, "What courses do you teach in photography?" And they said, "We don't teach photography. It's not an art, not a fine art." So I did manage to find a class in photography, but it was taught in the agriculture school. I don't know why. And then in graduate school, where I went to get a MFA degree in creative writing, I took time off to become the staff photographer of the Reidsville, North Carolina Review. So I was a newspaper photographer, a photojournalist before I ever got to New York. But in any case, I came to New York wanting to be a poet. I wanted to be part of this exciting development in the poetry world called the New York School of Poets that sort of descended from John Ashbery, Frank O'Hara. Unfortunately, there were a lot of people in line ahead of me, Peter Sheldall being one of the more notable. Excuse me. But since I knew a little bit about photography and I was involved in the poetry world, I sort of consoled myself about my third string status as a poet by taking pictures of poetry readings. This is a reading at St. Mark's in the Bowery, which was the centerpiece of sort of vanguard poetic practice at the time. This is a reading in 1972 given by Patti Smith. Somewhere in the audience was probably Robert Mapplethorpe or maybe Sam Shepard. And then in the front row were the people that ran the poetry project, Ann Waldman and Maureen Owen, and a poet named Ted Greenwald next to them. And Ted was the person that introduced me to a place in Green Street in Soho called 98 Green Street, where he was in charge of the poetry reading program. So I want to talk a little bit about 98 Green Street, which was my introduction to the world of Soho. So Soho started out only shortly before I got to New York. It started as a place where artists could create their studios and later living lofts, even though it was illegal, because it had been a place of small manufacturing. There were these fabulous cast iron buildings with large floors, but they had been largely abandoned, so artists took them over. So in the wake of it becoming an artist neighborhood, galleries started to open. Paula Cooper was probably the first in 1968, followed a couple years later by the opening of 420 West Broadway, which housed Castelli, Sonnabend, Andre Emmerich for a short time, and then other galleries further down the street, like O.K. Harris and John Gibson. Same time, artists created spaces, one of the most famous of which is 112 Green Street, which was largely a space for contemporary sculptures. It's sort of also one of the original artist spaces, a development that became national a few years later. And there was a artist-run restaurant called Food, in all capital letters, that was where you could go to eat, because Soho, believe it or not, if you go to Soho today, there was no place to eat in Soho, and definitely no place to go to the bathroom either. So one of the characteristics of the environment there was that it wasn't just a visual art world. It was a world in which art mixed freely with poetry, with performance, with music, with theater. Jonas Mekas started Anthology Film Archive not far away. The Vasulkas started a place called The Kitchen, where they showed video and also art exhibitions, and it was kind of a great melding or today we would say multidisciplinary kind of a scene. And 98 Green Street took part in this. So this is not my photograph, but this is a picture of a performance I went to at 98 Green Street by Robert Kushner, where he dressed all the performers up in fruit, and the performance culminated with them eating the fruit off of each other. Very puzzling at the time. 98 Green Street was a creation of Holly and Horace Solomon. Horace was the heir to a bobby pin fortune, and Holly was a sort of erstwhile actress who she liked to tell you all the time had had her portrait made by Andy Warhol, and then she became eventually a gallerist with the Holly Solomon Gallery. They had a remarkably fluid program, not only the poetry readings, but exhibitions. It's where Laurie Anderson gave some of her earliest performances where she sang and played violin. The exhibition program actually gave shows to certain photographers. William Wegman had an early show there. Stephen Shore had a show there in advance of Light Gallery, and Robert Mapplethorpe had a show there. The space itself and the opening show of 98 Green Street was created by Gordon Matta Clark, who is a generative figure throughout Soho, a co-founder of 112 Green Street and a co-founder of the restaurant Food. So I want to talk a little bit about Gordon because he was essential to my sort of understanding of how photography was operating within the worlds of contemporary art. So this is a picture of Gordon at Cornell, which is where we met. It was in the late 60s. And this is a picture of him at the Earth Art show that was put on by the Andrew Dixon White Museum, but obviously extended out into campus. This is a campus lake called Beebe Lake. For the Earth Art show was organized by the Andrew Dixon White Museum, which used to be Cornell's museum, but the guest curator was Willoughby Sharp, who with Liza Baer was the founding publisher and editor of Avalanche. We've mentioned Avalanche before. So the show included artists like Dennis Oppenheim, Jan Dibbets, Robert Smithson, Hans Hacke, sort of a who's who of artists who became associated with Earth art or other kinds of art later on. And Gordon, who was studying architecture, got involved with helping out people like Dennis Oppenheim. That's who's on the left here. Gordon's on the right. They were cutting this trench through the ice in the lake to the edge of the gorge. Today, your university lawyers would not allow this to take place, needless to say. So Gordon was inspired by working at the Earth Art show and decided to create his own Earth art work. This is a piece called Rope Bridge, which he erected at the Ithaca Reservoir. And knowing, like all Earth artists, that no one's going to see it if you don't have a record of it, he asked me if I could take pictures of it. So I actually took the first pictures a picture of Gordon's first significant work of art in 1969. Gordon then moved to New York, where he was from, and quickly fit into the art scene that was developing in Soho. 1970, he did a famous, his first exhibition, now legendary, was a piece called Photo Fry. And I think that's interesting that he immediately sort of took to the idea of photography as being something a material he could work with. Photo Fry consisted of Polaroids that he coated with gold leaf and then put into a frying pan with fat and proceeded to fry, just like it sounds. He also produced then photographs of holiday cards with photographs of trees that he photo fried as well. In any case, this is Gordon and his dog with my friend Joan Simon, who also was a friend at Cornell, on the streets of Soho, probably in 1972. And you can't quite tell, but Joan's holding a copy of Avalanche. I love that. Anyway, Gordon, by the time I got to New York, Gordon was at the nexus of the new art scene. He'd become a central figure in Soho. And he was also busy in the Bronx, where he was excising portions of abandoned tenement buildings and taking pieces out of them and then bringing them back. He was also photographing the the insides of these abandoned tenements. And I got involved because for his fall 1972 show at 112 Green Street, he wanted to print those photographs together in a large scrolls that he called Walls paper. So through my friend Joan, who's here, who was the publisher of Walls paper through her press called Buffalo Press, I was enlisted to go out and help with the press check. I was working for this little startup newspaper in New York at the time, and so I knew how to do press checks. So we went out. This is the printing plant in the Bronx, nicely enough. And I tried in vain to get the printers to clean up the colors and sort of, it came out kind of off register. And I said, no, you got to fix this all up and make it look good. And Gordon said, no. This is the way I like it. So why I was there to do a press check, I have no idea. Anyway, so they became part of the show at 112 Green Street, which had the sculptural element, which was the excised portions of the Bronx tenements. It had on the walls these scrolls of his photographs of the Bronx tenements. And then outside it had a piece called Dumpster Duplex, which was rented a dumpster and then built a 2-story building inside of it. And this is a picture I took of Gordon barbecuing at an event that marked the opening of the show. Gordon was very involved in food, and this is sort of characteristic of the period, is that cooking could be an art form if you wanted to make it that. Famously, Gordon had an evening at food restaurant where he served the bones menu, in which every item was made from bones. Yum. But the point is that, and I think this is important for thinking about photography becoming an art, is that suddenly everything was open. Like food could be art, pieces of buildings could be art. There were playing the violin and singing could be art. There was this incredible sense of possibility and openness to all kinds of new forms, of which, I don't know why, but photography seemed like a new form to many of these artists, and video definitely was a new form for these artists. Gordon then went on to make a career most famous for doing interventions in buildings, where he cut buildings apart. This is his masterpiece called Splitting in 1974, which was made possible by Holly Solomon. And this is Gordon's photograph of it. He photographed it. This is a 35 millimeter slide, and he filmed the process of doing it. There's a movie about it. So he was always conscious of the fact that this documentation had to be done of what he did. And this is characteristic of early artists' use of photography, as they thought of it in terms of documentation. He went on to cut lots of other buildings before he was diagnosed with cancer and died prematurely in 1978. This is an example of a project he did called Conical Intersect in Paris, but in 1977 he moved to a new studio and he built a dark room because he was interested in this new process called Cibachrome, which had been introduced in the United States in 1975. Cibachrome offered several advantages, one of which is you could take your slides and directly print a positive from it. You could do that at home, and it was rumored, at least, to be much more permanent, less fugitive than the Kodak processes that were available then. So Gordon actually became entranced with Cibachrome and realized he could cut up and make these kind of collage pieces from his existing trove of photographs. And basically, I didn't recognize this fully till later, he was becoming a photographer, and some of his fellow artists actually criticized him for being too much like a photographer in the way in which his art was turning. But as I mentioned, that was all sort of cut short by his premature death. So Gordon was really important not only to the Soho scene, but also to me personally, because he exposed me to a way of looking at photographs in relation to art that I would have otherwise never considered. So as a result of that, I started wandering around the streets of Soho looking for contemporary art that included photographs, and there was a lot of it. There were conceptual artists using photographs. There were performance artists using photographs. I've mentioned earth artists, of course, that all these different practices were fully engaged with photography. So there was this downtown realm of photographic activity that I sort of felt like I discovered on my own. Meanwhile, I was living uptown. I somehow wandered into Light Gallery, I guess because it was not just nearby, but also advertised itself as being devoted to photography, which I thought was a good idea. And I experienced many of the early shows. I can't remember exactly the first time I walked into Light Gallery, but Sally was probably there and Marvin was probably there. I definitely remember seeing the Stephen Shore snapshot show that Michal just talked about and thinking, what the hell? I was much more comfortable with the shows that Light was having of Cortege and Callahan and Siskin, Strand even, not a personal favorite, but my sense of what photography was at the time was related to that kind of work. I mean, my favorite photographer at that time in the whole world was Edward Weston, right? Like the day books. So I was less comfortable with people like Mark Cohen, whose picture this is from 1974, who would roam the streets of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and sort of, with his little camera and flash, attack people in this odd little sort of interruptive way. Michael Bishop, whose early work was in black and white, but then was one of the earliest photographers I knew that started making really interesting color photographs. And all you young curators out there should be thinking about doing a Michael Bishop show, because you can't even find them on Google. Otherwise I'd show you one. And then wacky work by Tom Barrow. I mean, I was just totally disconcerted by this, but I loved it. It fascinated me. Of course, I also, at the same time, was going to Lee Whitkin Gallery and Marge Nightcrew Gallery and other places. So it wasn't the only game in town. I remember going to a Whitkin Gallery opening in 1972 in which it was a Les Krim's show, and his mother was there making chicken soup with her blouse on. In any case, speaking of Tom Barrow, this is an example of a picture that mystified me when I first came to Light to see the show. Luckily, Larry Miller was there to try to explain it to me. So for me, what Light did was actually give me a sense of this photography field that I didn't have a clear sense of. I knew about Moholy-Nagy, but until I started thinking, or sort of got interested in what Light was doing, I didn't see that there was this connection between Moholy to Callahan and Siskin to a whole realm of students, many of whom end up showing at Light Gallery. Tom Barrow being one, Emmett Gowan, Doug Prince, Larson, Bill Larson, Linda Connor. They all had a connection to Callahan and Siskin. If you look at this handy-dandy chart that, in case you haven't had a chance to look at it, I don't know what you call this. It's not a Venn diagram. It's something else. But it's got all these connections between people and institutions and where they're from. And if you look at all these lines, about half of them go back to Callahan Siskin Institute of Design and Rhode Island School of Design. The rest of them go to places like the Visual Studies Workshop, which was a whole scene starting in the late 60s. The Visual Studies Workshop was founded in 1969 by Nathan Lyons, and also a whole California contingent which was so far away I couldn't really analyze it that well. In any case, so as the 70s went on, what happened, which I think has already been mentioned several times, is that there was a kind of crossover period or a series of interpenetrations of this world of photography that Light Gallery introduced me to, and the world of artists using photographs that Gordon Matta Clark and Soho had introduced me to. So famously, in Soho, Sonnabend Gallery started showing a lot of photography, and this was a big deal. They first showed the Beschers in 1972, and then throughout the 70s they showed David Hockney's photographs, David Haxton, Jan Groover, Boyd Webb, and starting in the 80s, Hiroshi Sugimoto. Elin Wingate, who ran the gallery with Ileana in New York for much of the 70s, told me that Ileana would actually take him to go look at photographs, that she was a great fan of Neue Sachlichkeit and other kinds of, basically the history of photography, and they would go to Witkin, and guess what they did there? They looked through the bins. At Castelli, Marvin's already mentioned that Louis Baltz had his first show when the gallery is still uptown, and then in 72 had another show when it was open in Soho. And then when Castelli Graphics got serious about photography, Marvin went there in 1977, and they became a real center for looking at photographs in art context as well. At Light, there were some interpenetrations. This Lucas Samaras is probably not the exact picture, but there was a Lucas Samaras photo transformation done on an SX70 shown in a SX70 show at Light in 1973, shortly after Pace Gallery had done a whole exhibition of Samaras's photo transformations the same year. And in 1974, I want to ask Harold how this happened, but they showed Jan Groover's triptychs that had been produced when she was just starting to be represented by Sonnabend Gallery. So we've already mentioned that Light Gallery was part of a new wave of, or inspired a new wave of photo galleries besides the ones that were already there, and I just want to mention a few names. There was, by the end of the 70s, there was Marcus Pfeiffer, Helios, Scott Elliott, Prokopis, Photograph Gallery that Cordia Worth ran, then Danny Wolf. And it was also happening outside of New York. Harry Lunn actually started in his gallery in the late 60s, but started showing photographs in the 70s. Halstead Gallery, Tom Halstead, opened in Michigan. The Focus Gallery in San Francisco was around. So I benefited from this wealth of galleries showing photography because it was a territory for criticism. There was a famous, there was a tradition in New York of poets becoming art critics, or at least writing about their friends in pages of art magazines. So I started writing first for Art in America. I remember reviewing a Michael Bishop show there. And that gradually that led to writing for the Soho News, which gradually, with Charlie Traub's help, led to writing for the New York Times. So even though I hadn't intended to be a photography critic, which is, I guess, what I ended up being, all this sort of groundwork for understanding photography that I could then write about was laid in the early 70s before I even started writing about it. Last picture. You have to excuse me for seizing the moment to show my own work, but part of what inspired me to become a critic was that I decided my poetry career was not going to go anywhere, and I, like most of us at the time, I started in the photography field wanting to be a photographer. I was really interested in photography, but that was sort of whipped out of me by taking a Lisette Modell workshop at the New School in 1973. This is a picture that I took at the end of the semester with Lizette. Having bored her the entire semester, I finally said, well, shoot, I'm going to do what I think she'll like, which is make like Deanne Arbus. So I went to a Halloween party at the Waldorf Astoria that was produced by Howard Stern and featured the New York Dolls and photographed the people that were in the audience, most of whom were dressed up rather well. And I brought them back and showed them in class, and Lizette said, "Now you're getting interesting." And I thought, well, that's a game I don't really want to play anymore. So I ended up putting most of my energy into being a critic from then on, and I think that was a wise decision because I actually, in retrospect, managed to be a witness for photography at what I think is the most incredible time that you would ever have wanted to pay attention to it, and hopefully, for those younger people today, they will look forward to having exciting decades as in the future as much as I experienced the 70s and the 80s. Thank you. Oh, there's another bonus picture.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. So we're going to take a brief break now. You're welcome to get some coffee, to use the restroom. We're going to be back here in just 20 minutes for Q&A with our morning presenters. Oh, I think. Oh, yes. Like, I think, yeah.
Ms. Allen, I will be helping you. I'll bug you at some point about paperwork sometime today.